A platoon of new recruits pile off the bus and loosely line up. The drill sergeant starts in complaining that he hasn't even been given men to work with. "You think you're something," he shouts, "but you're nothing. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I'm in charge." "Big deal," says the recruit at the end of the line. "So you're in charge of nothing."
I've heard it said that if Jesus is not Lord of all, then He's not Lord at all. The Lordship of Christ is in fact the crucible issue for Christianity today. Was Jesus really Emmanuel, God with us? And if He is God, then is He Lord of all? One of the doctrines of Jesus that caused a great deal of political thunder was this: the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath day. What most people don't realize is that that claim is more than a claim of lordship over our hearts. It's also a claim of lordship of our time. There really is little value in being in charge of, well, nothing. It really makes no sense to say you're a parent when you have no children, or to say you're the boss when you have no employees. In Matthew 12:8, Jesus claimed to be Lord of something, the Sabbath. But if there's no Sabbath, He would be Lord of nothing instead of Lord of something. So what is this teaching of Jesus that caused such a commotion? What is this Sabbath, this 1/7 in time that Jesus said He was Lord of? Stephen is standing by to help us answer this question.
Thanks, Charles. I'm standing on the Mount of Olives, just east of Jerusalem, to show you how far a Sabbath day's journey is. It was permissible to walk from Jerusalem to here and still keep the Sabbath holy. Originally, a Sabbath journey was just 2,000 cubits, but over time, it was modified to 4,000 cubits, or about 1 mile. While the concept of a Sabbath day's journey is mentioned in Acts 1:12, it's not a commandment of Scripture, but an added oral law of the rabbis or the Mishnah. Even in Christ's day, the laws regarding Sabbath had been expanded. The Sabbath had become a burden instead of a blessing. Man's addition of legalistic rules regarding the Sabbath has clouded the fact that the Sabbath is really an issue of time. We live in time. Time is represented all around us, from grandfather clocks to iPhones, wristwatches, and timers, from timeouts to on time. It's everywhere. Time is, in fact, a created construct. It's the arena in which the game of life is played out and experienced. Time is there just like air, lived in and experienced, though not always in the forefront of our consciousness. I'd like to share a thought with you. For some, this may be a new thought, but the God of all creation, the God who organized the immensely complex language of DNA, the God who sent His Son to this planet to live for us, to die for us, wants to spend time with you. In fact, the Creator of all things set aside a certain time each week for intimate communion and fellowship. This time is set more surely than a doctor's appointment, the work schedule, or even a family vacation. It's called Sabbath. Some people have been misinformed about this time God set aside. They've been told that the Sabbath was made for the Jews. I hear that all the time, but it couldn't be further from the truth. To get the story straight, one need merely look at the book of Genesis. Man was created on the 6th day of creation. The inspired author of Genesis goes on to tell us in chapter 2, verse 3, that on the 7th day, God created the Sabbath, a space of time to be used for rest. Okay, now don't miss this. If you drew a timeline of creation, Adam and Eve were created sometime during what we now call Friday. A few hours later at sunset, God invites Adam and Eve to rest. Rest? Rest from what? They're not even 24 hours old, so you know they're not at all tired. But Adam and Eve weren't being asked to rest from anything. They were being asked to rest in something. They were being invited to rest in the finished work of God's creation. And how many Jews were in the Garden of Eden at the beginning of the world? None. Really? Check it out. The Sabbath was given to perfect people in a perfect world with no taint of sin. The weekly Sabbath was not a type or a shadow of things to come, but a living memorial of time in honor of God's creative power. Genesis 2:2 and 3 tells us, "And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day, and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." It's important here to notice that after creating for 7 days, the very first thing God ever made holy, the very first thing he ever sanctified, was time. He called it Sabbath. Some have suggested that the Sabbath was just a time for God to rest, as stated here in Genesis. But to come to that limited conclusion, you must ignore the plain words of Jesus.
That's so true, Stephen. And Jesus himself stated why he created the Sabbath. You'll find that in Mark chapter 2. Jesus was walking with his disciples through a grain field one Sabbath afternoon. His disciples were hungry, so they took some grain in their hands, they brushed the husks off, and they ate it. This greatly troubled the Pharisees, not because the disciples were stealing, for it was permissible according to God's law to eat to satisfy one's hunger. But to the Pharisees, the disciples were harvesting on the Sabbath, which was work. And working on the Sabbath is unlawful. The Jewish leaders had taken the law and made it an idol. They accused Jesus of breaking the very law that he had given to Moses. And here's where Jesus' doctrines, his teachings, create a great deal of thunder in the Holy Land. He claimed to be the Lord, the creator of the Sabbath. And then Jesus says about the day that he created back in Genesis, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Now don't miss this. The Sabbath was not merely for God to rest, and the Sabbath was not made for the Jews. Jesus taught, it's the doctrine of Christ, that the Sabbath was made for mankind, all of us, perfect people as well as sinners. Unfortunately, traditions had grown up around the Sabbath that made it a burden, even a curse. But Jesus, who is the Lord of the Sabbath, came to put his law back in its proper place. You see, the Sabbath is not some burden to be borne. It's not a penance inflicted upon us to create holiness. The Sabbath is God's gift of his personal presence to all mankind. Even Moses knew this. When God sent him to Egypt to deliver the Israelites from bondage, the very first thing he did was to insist that they stop working on the Sabbath. Moses reminded the children of Israel that this was God's holy time, time set aside to rest. Rest from their slave labor? No. They were to rest in his delivering power and his awesome might. God's people, again, began keeping the Sabbath before they even left Egypt and went to Sinai. This is why Pharaoh began to complain. Exodus 5:5 says, Pharaoh said, "Behold, the people of the land are now many, and you, Moses and Aaron, make them rest from their burdens." The word rest here in Hebrew is the word Shabbat, or Sabbath. At this point, the people hadn't even gotten to Mount Sinai. The Ten Commandments had not yet been written in stone. But God's people in every generation have known that God desires to spend intimate and special time each week with his children. This is why God gave his people the Sabbath back in Eden. And this is why the Lord of the Sabbath wrote with his own finger this command in stone: remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The command begins with the word remember, because they already knew about the Sabbath, this gift of time. God wants to use this time to fellowship with us, to commune with us in a special way. It's his purpose to use this time to bring restoration in our lives, to our homes. He wants to use this time to heal marriages, and to bless our communities.
That's good news, Levi. But two questions here beg to be asked. First, the Jews here in Israel keep Saturday as the Sabbath. But how do we know that Saturday is the correct day for the Sabbath? Maybe the weekly cycle has been changed or lost track of. How can we know that God's Sabbath is not Friday or Sunday or Tuesday? To help me nail this down, I've asked Shalom David, a Jew who pastors here in Jerusalem, how we can know that our present Saturday is the Sabbath of Jesus.
Well, first you need to understand that history is written to give us continuity with the past. In Exodus chapter 16, we're told that God gave the people bread to eat. Most people have heard the story about the manna. But when you carefully read the entire chapter of Exodus 16, you discover that God was testing them through this process. The manna God sent from heaven would only fall for 6 days, Sunday through Friday. Each day, the children of Israel were to gather 1 omer, or about 3.5 liters for each man. If they gather more than the amount and try to keep it overnight, it would spoil before the next day. On the 7th day, the Sabbath, no manna would fall, so the people were commanded to gather 2 omers on Friday, but the extra omer of manna gathered on the preparation day was miraculously preserved and was good to eat on the Sabbath. If this happened just 1 day or a month, or 2 perhaps, that would be a miracle enough. But this went on for 40 years. 52 times every year God showed the people by miraculous means what day was his Sabbath. 2,080 times God made clear when he wanted to spend time with his people.
So how would that show us today that this Saturday, now kept as Sabbath, was the same Saturday Sabbath of the Exodus?
Because in the 12th chapter, at the beginning of the Exodus journey into the wilderness, God gave them a new calendar which has been continuously observed in the Jewish community to this very day. There is absolutely no question that this Saturday on your calendar is the same Sabbath of the Jewish calendar, from the Exodus to this very day.
Okay, our Saturday is the Sabbath of the Old Testament. So here's a second question. There is extensive tradition in the Christian world today that the Sabbath was to be done away with in the new dispensation. Did Jesus really expect Christian people in the new dispensation to keep Saturday as a holy day?
Look, Jesus was a prophet, was he not? He predicted the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. This would not happen for 40 years into the future. In preparing his people for those terrible trying times, he told them to pray. Pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day.
So if Jesus had no intention of his disciples keeping the Sabbath 40 years into the future, then why would he tell his disciples to pray that they would not have to flee on the Sabbath?
Exactly. That is precisely the point. Using the manna, God was testing the people. Would they let him be their God, or would they make gods of their own reason? And he is still testing us to this very point today. What do we do with the God of creation, with Jesus and his Sabbath?
Stephen, Levi, and Andrea have helped us understand the history of the Sabbath, this time he made holy, this time he wants to spend with us. Time is one of the 7 fundamental physical quantities in the International System of Units. The great scientist Sir Isaac Newton believed that time is part of the fundamental structure of the universe, a dimension in which events occur in sequence. According to the author of Genesis, time is marked and measured by heavenly bodies. Days, months, and years are all determined by the rotations and circuits of the earth and moon in their journey through space. The daily cycle is predicated upon one earth rotation on its axis. The monthly cycle is determined by the sequence of the moon waxing and waning. The yearly cycle happens when our blue orb makes another circuit around the sun. But can you tell me why we have a 7-day week? It doesn't fit nicely into any planetary structure or pattern. There is only one reason for a 7-day week, just one. Because God, in 6 literal days, created our world. That's the reason He gives in the Decalogue. He created everything, and then on the 7th day, He rested. He paused to spend time with His newest masterpiece, His intelligent creation. From that time to the present, the weekly cycle has been made up of 7 consecutive days. From that time to the present, God has set aside a Sabbath, this weekly 24-hour period to spend with those who love Him. This time retunes us. It balances our spirits and opens the door of relationship between the Creator and His creation. This gift of time was a blessing to perfect people in a perfect world. And it's still a blessing today for those who choose to spend it with Him.
Claudia English is God's friend. It's a simple, uncomplicated relationship. But it wasn't always that way. In all his first 20 years, Claudia had nothing to do with God. He didn't have anything against religion. He simply had had no exposure to it. But one night, Claudia saw some activity at the sports arena, thought there might be a wrestling match. What he ended up attending for the next 5 or 6 nights was some meetings about Jesus and the Bible. Though he hadn't learned much, he was baptized following those meetings, and in his heart a single-minded flame of resolve that was never to be extinguished had been kindled in the deepest core of his being. No matter what, he was going to be faithful to God. He didn't know how, he just knew he would. The second thing he knew about religion was that from now on he would be going to church on Saturday, the Sabbath of the Bible.
Shortly after I was baptized, I was drafted into the Army. I thought, well, that will interfere with my Sabbath, but I'm going to keep the Sabbath regardless.
And keep the Sabbath Claudia did. From sundown Friday till sundown Saturday, he disqualified himself from the Army by not showing up for roll calls. In an uncompromising way, Claudia had determined that that time belonged to his Creator.
I made him a good soldier for 6 days a week, but the 7th day wasn't theirs. It belonged to the Lord. And I served Him that day.
Claudia was deployed to the front lines in Korea and assigned to the Medic Corps, driving into no man's land to pick up the wounded. After receiving his orders, he gave the officers God's orders.
I explained to them just before they left me, I said, I want y'all to send me a relief up here 2 hours before sundown every Friday evening. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, and that's the Sabbath.
Even without a replacement, Claudia prayerfully but deliberately walked off the front lines, though he could have faced a court-martial or firing squad. Claudia says that he left God to take care of things.
The whole time that I was there, I never had any problem at all with the Sabbath. The Sabbath day really means a lot to me. It means more to me than anything else. The reason for that is because I love the Lord and I want to please Him in the things that I do and say every day.
Pavel Goia was born in communist Romania in 1964. Ceausescu's regime didn't take well to Christians who put God and His Sabbath above the state. But Pavel was raised by godly parents who taught him to pray and obey a living God who looks after His children.
I was 17 when I decided to start a business, glass business. And it was a co-op where the government would get 65% of your net clean profit and you'd get just 35%. And it was going pretty well. When the president asked me to work on Sabbath, I did explain that I cannot because of my faith, and he made fun. He said, there is no God. In this country, we don't believe in God. And he said, I would like to see God. Well, I went back and talked to him, and I told him, I cannot come. I will be willing to work a lot more. He said, no, you will come. That Sabbath, I didn't go to work for sure.
And the boss took full advantage of the situation and delivered glass that had been improperly stored outside. The glass was virtually welded together, and the crate was totally rotten.
So he said, you have 2 options. You come to work on Sabbath, and I will forgive you, or if not, you pay for it, and if you cannot pay, you go to prison. Well, I prayed about it and talked to him again, and I said, let me bring this glass back to the storehouse, to the warehouse, and I will double my work and double the profit you have, and if you are not happy, we talk then. And he smiled and he said, you cannot transport this glass because it's rotten. The boxes, the crates are rotten. You don't know what you talk about. And if you try to transport it, you will break it, and then you do have to pay for it. And I said, what do you lose? And he says, yeah, somebody needs to pay for this. I guess I don't lose anything. If you break it, you pay. If you don't break it, you work. Yeah, do that. So I hired a driver with a truck that had a crane, and when he came and saw the boxes, rotten boxes, he refused to do it because he was afraid he would be responsible if they break. I'm sure they would break. So I had to write a paper and sign that I will take full responsibility if something happens, so he would not have to pay for it. Well, the boxes, each box would be about 180 meters tall, 220 meters wide or long, 22 to 24 sheets of glass, each one 4 millimeters, altogether an average of more or less 4,000 pounds a box. The box would have some wood shoulders here and here that you put the cables around and hook it, lift it in the air, and then load it in the truck. Well, when the driver put the hooks around the shoulders and lifted the box, the first one, when it was high enough, when he did the rotation, the bottom of the box broke because it was totally rotten. The finger could go to the wood. And all that glass fell from the box. So in that instant, the glass stopped in the air and the box was over, moving slowly in the wind. And there was nothing under the glass, nothing over. The driver asked me, what should I do? I said, I don't know, just lower the box back. So as he was lowering the box was moving, he asked me to hold it. I caught the bottom of the box, kept it still, and as the box was coming down, it got to the glass, and the glass started to get inside, until the whole glass got all together inside. And he lowered it down to the ground, and then he put cables around, and I remember the president came to me. He was pale, he was afraid, and he said, I want you to go. You don't have to pay, you don't have to go to prison, you don't have to work on Sabbath. I just want you to go away from this place. Move, and don't curse me or my family. Just go. We don't want you close around. Please stay away from us. Sabbath is a clear command from God. And if we choose to obey in faith, He can use that for His honor and for His glory.
In every religion, men revere something. Shrines, cities, even people. They kiss holy land. They immerse themselves in holy water. Their ears clutch the syllables of holy men. Tangibles, touchables, holy things that they can see, revere, feel. In Genesis, however, the first thing declared holy is not a hill, a shrine, or a place, but a block of time, the seventh day. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. The word sanctified is translated from the Hebrew as kadosh, which means sanctify, hallow, or to set apart for holy use. Though creation dealt with the heavens, the earth, the birds, the sea, and the beasts of the earth, all things of space, it was time, not space, that God first pronounced blessed and holy. And this action makes sense because besides space, time is the dimension in which God's creation, the heavens, the earth, the birds, the sea, and the beasts of the earth exist. Also, if God had made one specific place holy, a hill, a spring, a city, not all people would have easy access to it. They would have to travel to worship there. But time comes to us instead of us going to it. Once a week, at 1,000 miles per hour, the approximate speed at which the earth rotates on its axis, the Sabbath circles the globe, arriving on one sundown, leaving on the next. The seventh day washes over the planet each week like a huge cleansing wave. We never have to seek it. The day always finds us. Meanwhile, holy cities can be burned. Holy people can be killed. Holy shrines can be looted. But time is beyond fire and knife. No man can touch, much less destroy it. Therefore, by making a special time holy, God has made the Sabbath invincible, placing it in an element that transcends any devices of mankind. Armies can sack cities. Rulers can ban pilgrimages. But no military tank, no swirl of ink can keep away the seventh day. We can no more stop the Sabbath than we can the sunrise. God protected this memorial from the objects of space, which are vulnerable to men, by placing it in time which is not. Finally, men can avoid holy things. They can hide from objects, people, places, but they cannot flee from time. We can ignore it, be ignorant of it, hate it, but the Sabbath always comes, and nothing, no one can stop it. Skipping over no man, yet beyond the destructive grasp of all, the Sabbath stands as the universal yet invincible memorial of God's work in making mankind. Framed in time, the most basic element of God's creation, the Sabbath, more than any other biblical symbol, points us to the essence of our existence, that we are the handiwork of God. Thus, as the prime symbol of our roots, the Sabbath tells us also who we are, why we are, and where we are going, all in a mere 24 hours. So, is Jesus Lord of the Sabbath or Lord of nothing? Is He Lord of your life? You can't say, yes, He's Lord of my life, if He's not Lord of your 1/7 in time. Will you spend that time with Him? He's waiting to spend each Sabbath with you.